The subcommittee will come to order, subcommittees, I should say. And this is a important and unique day. It is Human Rights Day, and both the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights, and my distinguished colleague, Ileana Ross-Layton, and her subcommittee are combined today in chairing this hearing and raising the issues of human rights abuse in Egypt. Today's hearing examines the escalating human rights abuses in Egypt. It is fitting that we are holding this hearing today on International Human Rights Day, December 10th, because we are witnessing grievous violence and other abuses directed against religious and political minorities, particularly the Copts and other Christians, about which our government and the media has said far too little, which seems to be a pattern worldwide. I would note parenthetically that the persecutions of Christians is escalating. Witness the slaughter of Christians in the Central African Republic, CAR. I would note Bishop Nungo of the CAR told my committee just a few weeks ago in this room that Christians were being targeted simply because of their faith, while the United Nations, the United States, and the rest of the world looked on. On Thursday, I will be chairing a hearing on American pastor Saeed Abedini, who is jailed and is suffering torture in Iran. Pastor Abedini's wife, Naghmeh, will tell our committee on Thursday, and I quote in part, "While I am thankful for President Obama's willingness to express concern about my husband and the other imprisoned Americans in Iran during his recent phone conversation with Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani, I was devastated to learn that the administration didn't even ask for my husband's release, which when directly seated across the table from the leaders of the government that holds him captive." She goes on to say, "My husband is suffering because he is a Christian. He is suffering because he is an American. Yet his own government, at least the executive and diplomatic representatives, have abandoned him. Don't we owe it to him as a nation to stand up for his human rights and for his freedom?" Unfortunately, there seems to be a pattern. After President Mubarak resigned in February of 2011, the world hoped for a new Egypt, a just government for all Egyptians, which would not make and replicate President Mubarak's mistakes, but reality has been just the opposite. Horrific anti-Christian pogroms have taken place under each of the post-Mubarak governments. For some of these abuses, the governments bear the responsibility of inaction. For others, they bear direct responsibility. In recent months, undercurrents of abuse and contempt for human dignity, long existing in Egypt, have turned into flash floods of violence. For example, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces presided over the Maspero protest massacre in October of 2011. At least 25 people were killed and more than 300 injured, almost all of them cops, when the military drove trucks through the crowd and used live ammunition against the unarmed protesters. Under the now displaced Morsi government, 3 low-level soldiers involved were charged with minor crimes and received 2 to 3 year sentences. No commanding officers were held responsibility for ordering or failing to prevent the deadly assaults. While Mr. Morsi and of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party at times voiced support for an Egypt that was home to both Muslims and Christians, his inaction belied his rhetoric. In April of 2012, St. Mark's Cathedral, seat of the Coptic Pope, was attacked by 30 to 40 Muslim youths. While dozens of Copts were sheltering inside, security forces joined the mob. Rather than dispersing the crowd, they participated in the all-night attack or stood idly by as rocks, gasoline bombs, and gas canisters were lobbed into the iconic cathedral. Despite this, President Morsi denied that the clash was sectarian in nature. After Mr. Morsi was removed in July of this year, the military ended the Muslim Brotherhood sit-in with violence, killing hundreds of protesters. Tragically, some in the Muslim Brotherhood scapegoated the Copts, although the Copts had nothing to do with the military's violent response. On August 14th, the day that we remembered as the worst day for Copts in some 700 years, 37 churches, 5 schools, and 3 Bible societies, 4 other Christian institutions and many homes and businesses were burned or damaged by mobs. More than 100 deaths were documented in the initial spate of violence and its aftermath. Some Copts have charged the military government in Egypt with allowing the attacks on Coptic persons, businesses, churches, and homes to continue, often inside of police stations and in spite of repeated and direct calls for help, in order to solidify government power as an alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as to justify their own heavy-handed crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood denies any involvement in the attacks occurring across the country and has at times condemned them. Yet the Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party branch in Helwan reportedly posted a statement holding the Coptic Pope responsible for Morsi's removal and otherwise linked Copts to attacks on the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood also called for Friday prayers to be held in an evangelical church in Minya after it had occupied it and converted it to a mosque on August 15th. Whoever the attackers are, and that is one thing we hope to learn more about today, the bottom line is that Coptic citizens are having their most basic human rights, freedom of religion, association, and equal protection of the laws, denied. We can never rest until human dignity, when it is so grossly trampled upon, nor can we ever accept the suffering that has marked Coptic life for decades, very much including the abductions, forced conversions, and forced marriages of Coptic girls and women. These abuses have continued unabated, and by some reports have escalated sharply following the Arab Spring, as have the abuse of the Egyptian courts to prosecute blasphemy cases against Christians, moderate Muslims, and secularists. Moreover, despite the nearly $1.5 million in foreign aid American taxpayers give to Egypt each year, neither the Mubarak government nor the Morsi government, or now the military government, has seen fit to return kidnapped American children, Noor and Ramsey Bauer, who were abducted by their mother to Egypt in 2009 in violation of a valid U.S. court order to the United States. They, along with some 30 other American children in Egypt, are forced to live without the love and guidance of an American parent who daily fights for their return while being stripped of half of their culture and half of their identity. In addition, freedom of expression continues to be under fire. The current interim government has been arresting and jailing journalists critical to the military government, jamming the broadcast signals, deporting foreign reporters, and otherwise closing the offices of news outlets that are, quote, broadcasting lies. In September of 2023 speech at the United Nations, the President stated that his approach to Egypt reflected a larger point. The U.S. will at times work with governments that do not meet the highest international expectations, but will work with them on our own core interests. These core interests were early defined in the speech to include the Camp David Accords and counterterrorism efforts, but I believe mistakenly have not included human rights. Human rights and the intrinsic dignity of every human being from womb to tomb are important in and of themselves. But for those who fail to grasp this, there is another important point to be made. It is the strategic interest of the United States to encourage governments to respect the rights of their own people, because governments that fail to do so are, in the final analysis, unstable. This should be the abiding lesson of the Arab Spring. The President also stated that future U.S. support to Egypt will, quote, depend on Egypt's progress in pursuing a democratic path. Again, it is unclear what that criteria entails. What if the democratic path does not include the protection of human rights, such as we saw under the Morsi government and now the interim government? It is not democracy per se that is to be the goal, but rather duly elected constitutional government that respects minorities, the separation of power, and fundamental human rights. Tyranny of the majority is not an acceptable option. What is clear is that the U.S. needs a new approach. This administration's short-sighted approach of not clearly linking aid to the protection of human rights in Egypt has been unequivocally ineffective. It is my hope that our hearing today will shed light on what went wrong and how the U.S. can be more effective in protecting human rights going forward. I yield to my good friend and distinguished colleague, Chairwoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.